Hi, so today we're going to talk about the inconsistencies and logical impossibilities in the Book of Mormon. So let's dive right in, guys. All right, let's start with the language. First Nephi, chapter 1, verse 2, and many others as well throughout the book. They talk about how Hebrews left Jerusalem and they came to the Americas and how they spoke Egyptian. It's a known fact that Hebrews spoke Hebrew, and the thought of them speaking Egyptian is ridiculous, and writing in Egyptian is ridiculous. And Mormon 9, verses 32 and 34, it states that the language was Reformed Egyptian, but Reformed Egyptian has never been recorded, heard of. It is just a completely unknown language. They've never recorded Reformed Egyptian. So moving on, let's talk about the fruit in 1 Nephi 17, verse 5. Talks about having ample fruit and wild honey being products of the Sinai desert called bountiful. This is not possible because if you're going to have wild honey, you have to have bees, and honeybees were brought over by Europeans hundreds of years later. So how could they have all this wild honey and fruit in the desert? It's just not possible. They also, in 1 Nephi chapter 18, verse 1, it talks about all of the timber, loads and loads of timber that the Jews used to build a ship. There's not ample timber in that area at all. It's a desert. And it's still a desert. There's just, it's impossible. They would not have found timber there to build a large ship or any ship. The Laman River in 1 Nephi chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. It talks about the river named Laman that flows into the Red Sea. There's never been a river there. There is no river there. So that, again, does not make any sense. It just simply does not exist. Okay, moving on to the mention of wheat and barley and olives, etc. There are more things mentioned as well, and none of them were in the Americas at that time. They did not exist in North America or either of the Americas back then. North America also had no cows, no donkeys, no horses, and no oxen. The Europeans brought these over hundreds and hundreds of years later. North America did not have lions and leopards or sheep at that time either. And like I mentioned before, honeybees, again, are mentioned, but they were brought here by the Europeans much later. Ether, chapter 9, verses 18 and 19, lists domestic cattle, cows, and oxen, all being separate species. But they didn't exist in America at that time. This is another thing that's interesting to note. The Book of Mormon talks about how swine were super useful to men. But even if they were useful, we're talking about Jews. And Jews would not think of swine as being useful or good or anything because swine were forbidden. They were an unclean animal. And so the Jews would not have used unclean animals really for any purpose. Horses, donkeys, elephants, not here. I mean, elephants? Anyway, and also the Book of Mormon talks about curulams or kumams. Those animals have never been recorded or heard of ever or identified anywhere. And domestic animals that are supposed to be super useful, they would hardly become extinct or be unheard of. So that, again, just doesn't make sense. So, Ether, chapter 9, verses 30 through 34. It talks about the poisonous snakes that drove sheep to the south. And the Book of Mormon says that the people ate the animals that were killed by the snakes. But again, we're talking about Jews here. They would not eat animals that were killed that way. Biblical time Jews, no way. They had very strict laws and ways of doing things, even when it came down to what they ate and how they killed them and all of it. Chickens and dogs did not exist here at that time either, yet you'll find them in the Book of Mormon. Butter is also mentioned, but there are no milk-producing animals, so how are you going to get butter? Yeah, so moving on, clothing material. So the Book of Mormon talks about silk and wool, and it also mentions moths, but none of those existed at that time, contrary to 1 Nephi 13, verse 7, Alma 4, verse 6, Ether 9, verse 17, and Ether 10, verse 24. Those are mentioned. And then Ether 15, verses 30 through 31. It talks about how Shiz was beheaded and raised up and struggled for breath. And again, this is just a impossibility. We do know that chickens, once you chop their heads off, they can still run around and do their thing, which is extremely creepy. But humans, not so much. Okay, let's talk about these miscalculations because this is a big one. In Ether chapter 6, we learn that the furious winds propelled the barges to the promised land for 344 days. Okay, so even if the winds were not furious, but just blew like 10 miles per hour, for example, the distance traveled in 344 days would have been 82,560 miles, or, in other words, more than 3 times around the planet. So this is just completely absurd. Why would also the Lord instruct Jared to make a hole on top and bottom of each barge, found in Ether 2:20? Anybody have an answer for that one? Okay, now let's talk about population. This is a huge issue, and I bring it up to Mormon missionaries, my Mormon neighbors and friends, and nobody has an answer. And I even looked up LDS.org today to see what it said. I'm going to post the link below. So read the description below. I'm going to post a bunch of my sources and some links, some really good ones that you guys should consider looking up. But LDS.org, how they describe the miscalculations of population throughout the Book of Mormon, like they basically just leave you with no answer. And then the last paragraph is like, well, we really shouldn't question it. Well, just like everything else, right? No, you should question it. I love how the Bereans in the Bible tested everything that Paul said. They heard him, went to the scripture, checked it out to see if it was true. That's what any logical thinking human being needs to do with anything out there, including the Book of Mormon. Okay, back to it. When Lehi left Jerusalem, according to the Book of Mormon, his group consisted of fewer than 20 people. It's a little group. Yet, 19 years later, the people had prospered and multiplied in the Promised Land so much that they built a temple which the manner of construction was like unto the Temple of Solomon, and the workmanship thereof was exceedingly fine, or exceeding fine. Ugh, some of the even grammar bugs me. But anyways, 2 Nephi 5:16 is where you'll find that. Okay, can we talk about what the Bible says about Solomon's temple? I have some stats here. We find that to construct it, it took 30,000 Israelites, 150,000 hewers of stone and carriers, 3,300 supervisors. This is found in 1 Kings 5, verses 13 through 16. And it took about 7 years to build it. 1 Kings chapter 6. I mean, this is just ridiculous, like unto Solomon's temple. Anyways, how many people could Lehi have had in his group after 19 years? Started with fewer than 20 people. 19 years have passed. I mean, even if they had a bunch of babies, they're still super, super young, and they would have a bunch of tiny little babies. So how does this tiny group of people build a temple like unto Solomon's? Ridiculous. The book further tells us that in less than 30 years after arriving on this continent, they had multiplied so rapidly that they even divided into 2 nations. Even the most rapid human production on the planet, I'm talking you having like as many kids as you possibly can in the shortest period of time possible, It would have resulted in like a few dozen in that brief of a time, and most of them would still be children and babies. And then about 1/3 were the older people. So do we have babies and toddlers building this Solomon-like temple and dividing into nations? Some tiny nations. And yet it talks about tens of thousands. Not only, here is where we touch on that, did they divide into two nations, but throughout the book, about every few years, they had devastating wars that killed off thousands. And they even mention in here, it's Alma 28:2, and throughout Alma it talks about killing off tens of thousands in the war. Absolutely absurd, impossible, and honestly just ridiculous. Okay, so let's talk about this. So after about the first 19 years or so, Laman and Lemuel and their descendants and followers, they turned dark. Their skin got all dark because of their disobedience. 2 Nephi 5:21. According to the Book of Mormon, dark skin color was a curse from God. This change of skin color takes place throughout the book, because in 2 Nephi 30, verse 6, we read that if Lamanites accepted the true gospel, they became white and delightsome. And since the 1981 printing of the Book of Mormon, they became pure and delightsome. But if they left this true gospel, they became dark and loathsome. So people's skin color does not change because of their faith or their belief in anything. This is absolutely ridiculous. And just the fact that this is even mentioned throughout the Book of Mormon is just crazy. And also, dark skin is not a curse. This is not biblical. This is not right. Okay, moving on. The Book of Mormon teaches that Indians, Native Americans, originated from the Jewish settlers. But Indians are absolutely Mongoloid. Their DNA has been traced back, and it is 100%. It's typical, the blood traits, it has the Mongoloid blue spot, and their facial features are of typical Asian origin. They are not Semitic or Jewish whatsoever. The current DNA evidence has confirmed this, so there's really no denying this. That's pretty huge. There's more, guys. Buckle your seatbelts. I'm trying to get through this quick. In Ether, chapter 7, verses, I just got lots of hair going on today. Ether chapter 7, verses 8 through 9, we read of steel and breakable windows. Chapter 2, verses 23, in Abraham's time. Try to explain this to an archaeologist, you guys. Steel was not even developed for another 1,400 years. Hold on, we got to take a little break. This is my little guy. He's my youngest. This is Marius. Meet my son. So I might need to pause for a second. Say hi. What are you chewing on? Okay, I had to disrupt this video because he's so cute. Okay, let me finish, okay? Good boy. Okay, sorry about that. Get back in focus here. Okay, so yeah, steel wasn't developed for 1,400 years. I brought this up to one of the Mormon missionary boys who came into my house. One second. So yeah, I brought this up to one of the elders who came to our house for a number of months and met with my family. And basically they try to just say like, oh, maybe they didn't know what to call it. So when Joseph was translating the Book of Mormon, he just wrote steel because he doesn't know what that material was called back in the day. Well, for one, if it's revelation from God, it would have been accurate. And two, come on. That's ridiculous. Like, what existed back then that was similar to steel? Moving on. End of the Book of Mormon. Moroni tells about a great battle that took place on the hill Cumorah. Over 200,000 people, armed from head to toe, they were killed on that hill. And the story tells about their weapons, breastplates, helmets, swords, etc. And nothing has been found on that hill or anywhere else in this continent. None of it, guys. As a matter of fact, metal, helmets, swords, etc. do not disappear in a mere 1,400 years. Absolutely impossible. We should be able to trace back, see all these things. It's not there. Before the LDS Church purchased the Hill Cumorah, it was literally dug full of holes and even caves. They dug that thing all around, through it, over it, on top of it, every side. Nothing was found. Joseph Smith told about a cave inside Hill Cumorah and how he and Oliver went in and out of it. Supposedly it had wagon loads of gold plates, the Laban sword, etc. Where's that now? Okay, so an interesting thing to note, when people just dig for worms in the Holy Land, dig for anything in the Holy Land, they find all kinds of archaeological discoveries all the time, current and in the last decades and for a very long time. But in contrast to the Book of Mormon, cities, places, coins, clothing, swords mentioned in the Bible have been found by archaeologists. But not one single place mentioned in the Book of Mormon has been located, identified, none of it. There are still people in the LDS Church that believe that the archaeology of the Book of Mormon has been proved, at least to some degree. And some missionaries are still using slide presentations of the ruins in Mexico and South America, implying that they prove the Book of Mormon. But they are from an entirely different time period, and they're ruins of old idol worshippers who offered human sacrifices. It really has absolutely nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. And in the mid-1970s, Spencer Kimball made a statement, and he published it in the Church News. And it said, people should stop looking for archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon, for there is none. And then LDS professor D. Green, in the book or pamphlet Dialogue, summer of 1969, pages 74 through 78, wrote, "The first myth we need to eliminate is that the Book of Mormon archaeology exists." He goes on to say, no Book of Mormon location is known. Bible archaeology can be studied because we know where Jerusalem and Jericho were and are, but we do not know where Zarahemla and Bountiful, nor any other location for that matter, are. So many Mormon scholars have faced this truth, and they completely agree with Professor Green, but sadly enough, the myth of the Mormon archaeology, it still surfaces in the general membership, the people who are uninformed and who just don't study it out. This is a really interesting story I want to include in this video. Thomas S. Ferguson was a firm believer, and he was sure that archaeology would prove the Book of Mormon. He was an attorney, and he believed that he knew how to weigh the evidence once it was found, and a lot of evidence was found. But unfortunately for the LDS Church, the evidence did not have any connection to the Book of Mormon. Ferguson spent hundreds and thousands of dollars and 25 years of his life as a head of the New World Archaeological Foundation, which was funded by the church, by the way. But in spite of all the efforts, by 1970, he had come to the conclusion that all had been in vain, that Joseph Smith was not a prophet, and that Mormonism was not true. So after 25 years being funded by the church, like dedicating his life to it, he was like, okay, well, forget it all. It's all false. None of it's true. He was a man who just devoted his entire life, even before starting this foundation, to Mormonism. And he wrote a book called One Fold and One Shepherd in defense of Mormonism. But later, he had to admit that the case against Joseph Smith was absolutely devastating, and it could not be explained away. The Book of Abraham was probably the final straw for him because... many other Mormons had an issue with this as well. It was just like the last thing with Mormonism. Once they found out the Book of Abraham was a total fake, it was like, there's no hope. That's another one of my videos. I will link it below. Please check out the Book of Abraham video because, that's an interesting one. People need to know about it. Totally fake, you guys. One other example I want to mention is B.H. Roberts. He is a noted scholar and a general authority in the Mormon Church, and his secret manuscript has only fairly recently been published, and he had come to question the Book of Mormon quite some time before this last guy I mentioned, Ferguson, did. B.H. Roberts' typewritten manuscript of more than 400 pages titled The Book of Mormon Difficulties was written sometime between 1922 and 1933. And in this manuscript, he admitted that the Book of Mormon is in conflict with what is now known from 20th century archaeological investigation about the early inhabitants of America. And what's interesting is this is a long time ago, and since then we've had decades in like incredible research, resources, everything. And yet still in 2019, there is no archaeology that exists. After going into a lengthy explanation of impossibilities in the Book of Mormon, he also says that he has come to discover things he didn't know earlier in his life. For instance, that Joseph Smith had access to a number of books that could have assisted him in giving him ideas for the Book of Mormon. Roberts tells how Joseph Smith's mother wrote in her book called History of Joseph Smith that long before Joseph had received the gold plates, he gave, and I'm quoting Joseph Smith's mother here, the most amusing recitals. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, their mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life among them. B.H. Roberts' Study of the Book of Mormon, page 243. I mean, that's really telling. This is Robert's own mom saying this. By the way, look into the history of the Smith family. I'll touch on that in another video. Okay, Roberts then goes on to say that Joseph could have gotten his information from knowledge that existed in the community because of books like Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews. Have you guys looked into this? Are you familiar with View of the Hebrews? It existed in the community. It was published nearby in 1823, and Josiah Priest's The Wonders in Nature and Providence, published only 20 miles away 1 year later. The latter had lots to say about the Hebrew origin of American Indians and their advanced culture and civilization, Roberts says. So if you look into View of the Hebrews, The Wonders of Nature and Providence, and also Manuscript Found by Solomon Spaulding, what's amazing is that these books contain the name Moroni, Mormon. It talks about Lamanites. It talks about Nephites. And if this was divine revelation from God straight to Joseph Smith as he translated the Book of Mormon, then how can other books out there contain these very same things, these very same names? There's no explanation for this. It doesn't make sense. But what does make sense is Joseph Smith, along with many others in the 1800s, they talked about and wrote novels about ancient American inhabitants. Let me quote B.H. Roberts once more here. He asks in his book, "Whence comes the young prophet's ability to give these descriptions," quoting the mother, "with as much ease as if he had spent his whole life with these ancient inhabitants of America? Not from the Book of Mormon, which is as yet a sealed book to him. These evening recitals could come from no other source than the vivid, constructive imagination of Joseph Smith, a remarkable power which attended him through all his life. It was as strong and varied as Shakespeare." B.H. Roberts, Studies of the Book of Mormon, page 244. It's really incredible that all of this, just like I said and B.H. Roberts said, this was all there for him to read and study and come up with more, imagination for the Book of Mormon prior to the gold plates ever been open to him. So yeah, I want to say also that before this, B.H. Roberts was known as the great defender of Mormonism, and he is still considered one of the greatest scholars the LDS Church has ever known. I have a visitor again. Hold on. Okay, so that's about all I'll say in this video. Some things to think about. It's very interesting when you start looking into these things. I want you to study out for yourself. Like I said, I have some sources that I will post below that I've read up on, and I've cross-examined them through many other sources. And then I also look up the passages within the Book of Mormon and the Mormon scriptures to see if the references are correct and if they do in fact say that, like mentioning steel and everything else. And they very much do, you guys. So look it up. I want to credit this section and what I read and the research behind it. I want to credit to Ronnie and Dennis Higley. They're ex-Mormons, used to be LDS for many, many years, left the church upon their own research. They had access as missionaries in Finland to the entire library of Mormon documents and historical documents, and they started digging, and they sure dug because they found all of this and so much more. So I'm so thankful for their ministry. Now they have a ministry. They are born again Christians, and their ministry is called His, H-I-S, Ministry. So look them up. I will post a link to their blog below. It is incredible, and you need to read it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys soon with another video.